All right, here we go. We are talking about Bible study today, and I'm talking about prayer, and really want to get into this and get started. And this covers a little bit of scripture that we may be familiar with, but definitely want to get into this right now. Um, it happened that while Jesus was praying in a certain place, when he had finished, one of his disciples said to him, "Lord, teach us to pray, just as John also taught his disciples." That comes from Luke chapter 11, verse 1. And we're getting into this particular passage to start off with our prayer challenge. And going from there, take it for what it is. This request made sense. And I want to get into this briefly about how much sense this request made by starting with this. Who better to ask than Jesus? Look at what was going on in this text. Jesus just finished praying. They asked Jesus, this one disciple asked Jesus, "Lord, teach us to pray." Look at it. Jesus often withdrew to the wilderness to pray. That's part of his practice. Jesus would get up early, go out to a solitary place and pray. Right? And Jesus would depart from the crowd, go to a mountain, and pray. Jesus was familiar with prayer. Who better to ask than Jesus? Jesus's prayer was a regular practice, and so that wasn't anything out of the ordinary for Jesus, and so who better to ask than Jesus? So this request made plenty of sense when we look at it. What better time to ask? When we look at it, Jesus was praying in a certain place, and when he had got done, that's when he was asked. That's when the request was made. Immediately following Jesus' prayer. He had just finished praying. No better time to ask than while it's right there on the agenda, right there as the subject at hand. Ask Jesus to pray. So there it is. Teach us to pray. Now here's the key part about this. I wouldn't rush to any conclusions, make any assumptions just because of the synoptic gospels. I'm talking about the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John is a standalone gospel. Simply because there is no correlation in time frame, sequence of what was taught and when it was taught when we look at the Gospels. And I say that because the Gospels, particularly the synoptic Gospels, even though they may have passages that mirror one another, Matthew has an example of the Lord's Prayer just as Luke has an example of the Lord's Prayer. And they occur in two different situations, and there are two different accounts of what happened, right? Luke is a very analytical secondhand account, right? That is pieced together from interviews and going through with other people's interactions with Jesus, firsthand and otherwise. And then you have Matthew, which is a firsthand account of what happened with Jesus. And so when we look at this text, let's not make assumptions about what happened or did not happen simply because we're aware that within the synoptic gospels, there are similar and mirrored passages and texts. And so keep that in mind, knowing that there's no sequence, with no sequential order or chronological order to the Gospels matching up. And remember, these are written to different audiences. Luke is very much written to a Gentile audience, while Matthew is written to a Jewish audience. And so just based upon that, the structure of each gospel is different with a different intent, and they're written in different time frames. And as I said before, they're written in from different perspectives. So keep that in mind, and definitely don't jump to any conclusions. So you have to look at each passage, right, and how it's written in its context. That's where I would stick with that. I would look at each passage as it's written in its context and take that into account. I hope that part helps. Because when we look at this, Jesus had taught at another point, also in Mark, but when you pray, go into your room, and when you have shut your door, pray to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who also sees in secret will reward you openly. That's mirrored in Matthew, but it doesn't mean that they're given in the same order or sequence. It's just that they're in the same synoptic sense, gospels that present similar situations, passages, teachings that may not be in exact phrasing as one another or in the exact time or sequence as one another. I hope that helps somebody right there. So let's get further into this request. This request was also made by, quote unquote, one of his disciples, according to Luke 11:1. It was one of his disciples. And let's talk about this some more. It happened that while Jesus was praying in a certain place, when he had finished, one of his disciples said to him, Lord, teach us to pray, just as John also taught his disciples to pray. And so when it says one of his disciples in this verse, it's really giving us an indication that there's a specific lone disciple of Jesus who is not identified, and not identified by name. Not that he's nameless. We know who the 12 are, and we can keep that in mind, but he's not identified by name. And even though he's not identified by name, it doesn't mean we can assume, like in the Gospel of John, that it's the disciple whom the Lord loved, or any other indicator, or that it's Peter or James or John. It's just someone who's not identified in this passage. And I hope we can live with that and not go into our, biblical detective work and try to figure it out. It's just an unnamed disciple. Accept it for what it is. And so this disciple also appears to speak for the whole group when he says, teach us to pray. He doesn't ask for it as a request for just teach me to pray. Teach us to pray. And I think that that's important when we look at this, that's where the request is coming. And he says, teach us to pray, and not just how to pray, but just as John, speaking of John the Baptist, taught his disciples to pray, right? And so in the request, he says, teach us to pray just as John also taught his disciples. And there's an indication there that John the Baptist had taught his disciples how to pray as well, right? And so this gives us some form of precedent of how the rabbis or masters were teaching their followers and different things that they were teaching them. And this is something that comes up here in Luke 11 about prayer. Also, when you look at Luke 18, Luke 18 and 1, when Jesus teaches them about prayer through a parable. And the prayer is supposed to teach them to always pray and not lose heart, right? And that's one of the things that we see as far as Jesus' teaching on prayer. But I would say definitely look at that and look at this passage as two different instances, two different occasions. And here's a disciple of Jesus asking about being taught how to pray based upon John the Baptist also teaching his disciples how to pray. And we can definitely look into it and see that based upon some other reading, maybe this was brought up among the group because there were existing disciples of John the Baptist who were among the followers of Jesus, particularly Andrew and John. If you look at John chapter 1, verses 35 through 39, you'll see that Andrew and John were part of those who were followers of John the Baptist. And so we can see this request making sense because among the group, here are followers of John the Baptist. And so teach us to pray just as John taught his disciples how to pray. And so let's take it like this. When we talk about the Lord teaching us how to pray, it gives us an idea of here's a man who has been demonstrating a personal devotion to prayer, taking the time out to make time for prayer and make prayer a regular practice of his own. And in him doing that, Jesus has shared and shown others, by his own actions, the importance of prayer. And so now, what is being asked of Jesus is to share that same practice of prayer, right? And so this is part of how we get into our 30-day prayer challenge. And our 30-day prayer challenge is going to occur for June of this year. And we're doing that right now. As far as our initial study, I'm going to keep doing it on Sundays here at this time, probably about 10, 15 minutes. Definitely check it out. We'll get into some things that, will definitely help us focus more on prayer. And we really want to get into not just the meat of, praying and just doing the practice of prayer, but really get into beyond the ritual of it and the routine of it, but, get a little closer to the Lord. And definitely see where we can get closer to the Lord through prayer, with communion with the Lord, and have some time with him and sharing that. And we'll be doing some blog posts on that, daily blog posts, get into it and share a few things about how to pray, different prayer pointers. There's a difference between interceding for others and really interacting with others when we pray. There's a different involvement. There's a different degree of involvement. And so definitely check that out, see what that's about, and see how you might want to join in and get involved throughout the month of June, praying every day. I love what Charles Spurgeon said, and it makes the most sense to me. And I definitely keep it in mind when I'm dealing with groups, in particular groups where it might just go for a while, where people have just really taken it to a different level. Spurgeon just said short prayers are long enough. Short prayers are long enough, and so when we get there and we get to it, we can definitely see that when we talk about prayer, we don't have to be long-winded. We don't have to be all day. We don't have to, as my previous pastor said, play the horns off a billy goat. We just have to keep in mind that short prayers are long enough, and we can get there and see that things are not necessarily a major, like a major undertaking, but we can just simply say, hey, man, I've given it to the Lord. I've gone to the Lord with it. I've given it to him, and I'm not trying to get it back. And so understand, short prayers are long enough, and God hears us. He hears our moanings. He hears our grumblings, according to the Apostle Paul, but he knows our heart, and he knows what we're trying to say, even if we don't know how to say it. He knows what we're trying to get out, even if we don't know how to put it out there ourselves. And so trust the Lord with what he has to share with you, what he has to say to you, and believe him in what he's talking about when he's sharing it with you in response. Remember, it's not just about us talking. It's about us hearing from the Lord. And so take this into account. As we go forward from here, we'll be talking a little bit more about the Lord's model prayer that we see further in Luke. And we'll be getting into a few more things from him on that level and what he's teaching us, what he's showing us. And like I said, how are we using it day by day? How are we getting closer to God? How are we getting into a mode where we are following God and his leadership, being guided by his spirit, and really taking it to God day by day? Listen, this was really a look at one verse and dissecting that one verse, and we'll take it piece by piece as we go from Luke chapter 11, verses 1 through 4. We'll do this for most of the time that we'll be here on Sundays at 8 a.m. For the month of June. Definitely enjoy this. Offer your input, your feedback, and love to hear from you. And I trust that the Lord is going to bless you by helping you with whatever you have weighing down your heart, that you can let it go and let it be released into his hands for him to handle, and trust him with it. And so we'll be back next week, 8 a.m., start breaking down the Lord's model prayer. And like I said, definitely check out the daily blog posts that we'll be doing. And I put it in the comments, and hopefully you'll be able to join us for this 30-day prayer challenge starting June 1st. And God bless. God be with you. Thank you for tuning in. Godspeed.